Now, immediately I want you to start thinking due on sale clause, and we're going to talk about that. But that's the one thing that I want you to consider here. And usually in that situation, very little equity is going to exist. They just want out. Do you know how many people just walk away from their properties? Not only when the mortgage is greater than the value, but when the mortgage is the same, they just walk away from their properties. I go through those houses. Ask Derek how many times that has happened here. Maybe Las Vegas isn't the best example because of the extreme decrease. But in a lot of markets, this happens all the time. The sellers just walk away because they can't afford it anymore and they have no other options. You're giving them an option here. And that maybe their only option in this case is to save their credit so that they can go on to live to fight another day. Is this ringing a bell? Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, if you could, just the mic, sorry.
I really like this one. What other than Atlanta, what market? Because in Phoenix, where my market is, the loan amount is way high than the market price.
Yeah, I would use this. Now, remember when I said there's a little bit of a delay? I think I would wait to use this in Vegas, in Phoenix, in those areas until after 2013. Remember I said there's going to be a little delay there? Right now, this seems to work very well in the emerging markets. Charlotte, Atlanta, Austin, Texas, Kansas City. I think those areas make it, in Chicago, those areas make it so that the mortgage amount isn't so much higher than the home value today. And this is when you would use this particular one right now.
How about multis?
I would say you could use this in multis, but it would be rare. It would be rare. This is really a strategy for single-family houses for most of the time. For multis, we're going to use that master lease option a little bit more in those cases. Okay? Multifamily and the strategies with multifamily are geared a little bit differently because they're an income-producing property. I was talking at lunch yesterday. Single-family houses historically have never been meant to be an investment. We've turned them into an investment. We've created a commodity almost with that. So we use different strategies with multifamily and single-family houses. This primarily is a single-family house strategy. It's not that you couldn't use it over there, but primarily it's a single-family house strategy here. Buyer pays for the, oh, I'm sorry, you can't see that yellow there. Buyer pays for equity at closing. This is where you give the seller a little bit of money for that excess equity in the property. How much? That's going to be negotiated. You're going to do that in a traditional sale anyway, correct? Okay? So buyer pays the seller's equity at closing. The seller deeds to buyer the property at closing. The loan remains in seller's name, just like we talked before. And the seller has no expectation related to cash at a later date when the buyer sells the property. So in the first scenario, there was no money that changed hands. We just came in, took ownership to the property, and the loan remained in the seller's name. There was no promise to pay anything in the end when the buyer sells that property. In this scenario, the same events took place with regard to loan staying in the seller's name. The buyer takes ownership to the property, but the buyer gave the seller a little bit of money for the equity, and that was all negotiated. Okay? That was all negotiated. Number 3, buyer pays the seller when the buyer sells. And this, by the way, is all determined in your sales contract and you're subject to addendum. You're going to put all this language in there. You're probably, if you're going to be meeting with your attorney, you're probably going to have your attorney put together a subject to addendum and a sales contract for each one of these situations. So the buyer pays the seller when the buyer sells. The seller deeds the property to the buyer at closing. The loan remains in the seller's name, so nothing has changed there in the first two. Seller expects buyer to flip the property. Now this is what's interesting with this. You have buyers out there that don't know how to flip a property. They don't know the concept of selling a property. Maybe they don't want to pay the commission to a real estate agent. Maybe, just maybe, you have a list of buyers that would buy this property at a higher price. So this is a way that you can do a flip of a property without doing a traditional purchase, coming to the money with hard money, or I'm sorry, coming to the closing table with hard money or cash, or if you can't get a loan. Maybe you know that you've got a list of buyers. You probably know where you got that list, right? Remember our exercise, open houses, click it, right? You remember that, right? Okay. And you have a list of buyers, and you know this house will sell for $150,000. You got a buyer that'll buy that right now at $150,000. You go to this seller and you say, listen, I've got a buyer that will buy this, and I'm going to flip it to that buyer, and I know that we can make $40,000 equity in that. I've got a buyer right now ready to go. But I want to create a subject to purchase here so that I can take ownership of it. I might do a little work to the property if need be, but I'll sell it to that owner within 3 months, and then you and I, it'll be in the contract, we will split those profits accordingly. Does that make sense? So this is a way that you can do flips without bringing money to the closing table or going to get a loan or anything like that. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Let's go back to what I talked about yesterday. A traditional real estate transaction is when you give the seller his or her equity and have them go away. That's really it. That's all you're trying to do here. So all of these techniques, if you haven't noticed by now, they're just variations of that one simple concept. In this particular instance, if I have no money and I'm going to do a flip in a market, like here in Vegas, I've got a hard money source, but I've got to come to the table with 30 to 40% down. What if I don't have that 30 to 40%? What do? I've got to get to 20. How do you get to 20? Well, I'm going to do a subject to on a property that I know I can flip, but I need to get the control of the property first. And because they already have the mortgage in place and I have the list of buyers, does this make sense? Okay? This is going to protect your interest in that as well. The next one, buyer pays seller some money up front, and when buyer sells, seller gets paid the balance. So now you're going to pay the seller twice. Buyer pays seller some money at closing, but not all that is due to the seller. Seller deeds to buyer at closing. Loan remains in seller's name. Seller expects buyer to flip or resell the property. Seller expects buyer to pay seller the rest of what buyer owes for the predetermined equity at the time buyer sells. You can actually handle this a couple ways. You've got this sill. You know what I mean? Don't just let the water run on you. Use soap. Anyway, this could be handled in a couple ways. Number one, this language is spelled out in your contract with the seller. Okay? The purchase contract, the subject to addendum, number one. Number two, the seller of the property can actually put a lien on the back end of the property so that secures their interest at the time of sale, where they would actually get paid at closing of that sale and pay off that lien. And that would be one of the ways in your communication to that seller on how you're going to protect their interest. Does that make sense? Okay. Seller pays buyer to take the deed. Now, this would be cool, right? This would be cool. I had a property that I bought for $40,000. And it was a really nice house. And the guy's name was Fuzzy. Heather, right. He had no hair. I don't know why we called him Fuzzy, but he had no hair. Yeah, that's a distraction.
Break time.
Yeah. Thank you for that distraction. Appreciate it. Hey, let's show the fat guy cookies. See how that works. But Fuzzy kept begging me to buy his property. He goes, hey man, please buy my property. His parents lived there. He grew up there. His parents passed away, not in the house. That would have freaked me out. But Fuzzy was like, you know, I need the money. Please buy my property. Is there any way you can buy my property? So I walked through the property. And the property, how do I describe this? He left it exactly like his parents left it to him. And Fuzzy was a bachelor, kind of fell on hard times, and wasn't the neatest person in the world. And when I bought the house, well, let me back up. When I walked through the house, it had everything in there. As a matter of fact, in the basement, and I've told Sil this story before, and every time I tell this story, I have a vivid vision or a vivid memory of what the smell was. There was a coffin freezer in the basement that had been unplugged for 20 years. Yeah, and it was full of meat. That'll kind of tell you what's going on here. Everything else in the house, they left. So I almost had Fuzzy talked into paying me to take the house. There was so much crap in there that I almost said, I don't know, you know, and I felt bad. I said, you know what, fine. I knew that I had to bring in so much time and labor to get the stuff out of the house. But I also knew that I was going to find a lot of stuff in the house that was valuable. That was my risk. I would hope that my cost to get the house cleaned out were, you know, under the $40,000, but I also knew that I was going to find a lot of stuff. Check out some of the items I found. So this is a side note, but I'm just saying that to get the buyer, the seller to pay the buyer, sometimes could happen. I got a solid silver bar, the Engelbrecht silver bars that, I don't know, things worth today, in today's money, $4,000. We got, Heather and I, we got a bag of jewels. They were, I was going to say not emeralds, but they were like, I forget what they're called. She would know. We had these bags, and I just set them aside. One day, we went downtown Chicago and got them all appraised, and I think they were probably another $4,000 or $5,000. You know, we had a bunch of them, and the first rock that the gemologist looked at said, yep, this one's worth $1,900. And we had a whole pile of different rocks like that, and I'm like, oh my God, we've hit payday. This is awesome. And then he'd look at the next one, he goes, yeah, this is probably worth 30. You know, and so it all totaled to about $4,500. I got a whole, like 2 full sets of Encyclopedia Britannicas that were, you know, older ones, so they were worth some money. We got a ton of stuff. We still have these. They're collector plates. I forget what they're called because I don't collect that stuff, but they have a registry number and a certificate number, and they're on their original boxes, and we've got like 50 of them, and they're worth like, I think she said like 150 a piece. Just different stuff like that, so it was well worth it. But sometimes you can actually talk the seller into paying the buyer to take the property, okay? So I know that does happen. So now I kind of want to focus back to this due on sale clause, because I know a lot of you are thinking, okay, what exactly is that? And I see people grabbing their pens. That's cool. This is a small print, but I'm going to read it to you. Okay? So don't worry about the small print, but I just took this off a regular mortgage. Due on sale or encumbrance. Lender may, that keyword may, at its option, declare the entire balance of the secured debt to be immediately due and payable upon the creation of or contract for the creation of any lien, encumbrance, transfer, or sale of the property. This right is subject to the restrictions imposed by federal law as applicable. This covenant, and what they're talking about there is the thing that I mentioned earlier today, the loophole. This covenant shall run with the property and shall remain in effect until the secured debt is paid in full and this security instrument is released. So some key words there. The one is may. If you have a mortgage out on a property and the payments are being made, it's not sending up any red flags to that bank. As a matter of fact, you know, as long as the bank's getting paid, number one, that's a good thing, okay? So they're not going to want to maybe on purpose go after a performing note that's already in place. So you've got things on your side, number one. Number two, a lot of times when you're dealing with a Bank of America or something else, and you're getting your taxes and insurance escrowed. In other words, your payment, or a homeowner's payment, is what we call PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. The taxes are escrowed so that when that tax bill comes into the bank can make sure those taxes are paid. Typically, if there is an issue, that's where it is. That's where it comes in. But I want to talk about how we mitigate that and what that means. So we're going to talk about that special loophole. We're going to talk about the notice that you need to give to the bank as we go along here, so just bear with me. I want to talk also about how we deal with the seller, because a lot of times I don't think you should be coaching the seller, but I think you should be kind of explaining the solution to their problem. They can't afford the mortgage, they need to get caught up on the mortgage, that's what you're there to do. You're not really giving the seller any type of legal advice, okay? You shouldn't be doing that. Or any kind of accounting advice. You shouldn't be doing that. But you could give them, through your contract, a solution to their problem, okay? Make no promises you can't keep concerning the lender. You know, let's just say the deal falls through. You can't say, well, the lender's not going to foreclose on you. They certainly could. I don't think that you're going to make any promises with regard to if something falls through with you. Maybe you can't get the tenant, or you misjudge the value of the home or the value of the rental market there. I want to make sure that you're not promising anything in which involves something that you cannot control, where maybe ultimately the lender does come into foreclosure, it does hurt the seller's credit, and that seller comes back to you, okay? So I don't think you want to do that. And then finally, I think you should do what you say that you're going to do. That almost goes without saying. A motivated seller is someone who needs to sell. We've talked about this. They're behind on their payment, they're struggling to make monthly payments. They're paying for a vacant house, maybe they've moved already, that's a really good one. A house is in major disrepair. So that's something visibly that you can tell as you're driving your neighborhoods. Or they've got a house with no equity. They've got a house with no equity. And they feel like the real estate market is not going to get better in their area. Okay? Or maybe even go down still. Okay? So let's talk about pre-screening the seller. What does this mean? A lead comes in. The lead could come from anywhere. Okay? You want to make sure that you're getting a good response from that lead. Be professional, build rapport, ask open-ended questions. Remember, open-ended questions are questions that retrieve information. Retrieve information. How long have you lived here? Tell me a little bit about the house. That's more of a statement than a question. Closed-ended questions, you're looking for a specific answer. Okay? Are you able to close this on this deal Thursday or Friday? That would be an example of a closed-ended questions. And listen, the seller, if you can get to the seller, or your partner can get to the seller, they're going to tell you what the problem is. Listen to the problem and apply a solution. I think that's going to be your biggest weapon here. If you're not the feet on the ground in a Charlotte or Atlanta, make sure you're talking to this with your partner, a Jill, for instance. okay? Or whoever it is for you guys.